We're shortly going to be painting landscape in a manner that's quite loose and wet. So in this video we'll look at aerial perspective, sometimes called atmospheric perspective, which works extremely well with watercolor washes. Aerial perspective is not to be confused with linear perspective of the sort we used on perspective grids. It's a perspective of sorts nevertheless, and pushes us to perceive some things as further away than others. Here is an actual photo of a view into the distance. If we laid a grid over the landscape, it might look like this, and the lines would converge in the distance due to the effects of linear perspective. Now here's the same view, more or less, from Google Earth, in which there's no aerial perspective. Notice how flat things look. Here's the actual photo again. You can see that veils of atmosphere and water vapor have reduced the contrast in the background, as well as making it bluer. Watercolor is a perfect medium for suggesting the effects of atmosphere and aerial perspective, in landscape painting particularly. As we shall see, you can also apply aerial perspective to anything, groups of figures, still lives, however subtly you might like to use it. Overlapping of shapes or forms also suggests perceived depth, and this applies to landscape as well. When we paint a landscape with hills, the closer hills will overlap the further hills. The combined effects of overlapping and aerial perspective can create a compelling sense of pictorial depth. It should be noted also that warm colors advance and cool colors recede, and the considered use of warm and cool colors can also create pictorial depth. Here are examples of strong aerial perspective in photographs. You can clearly see how darks get lighter as they recede into the distance, and how lights get darker. If we desaturate this photo, making it devoid of color, you can see the effect still applies. In summers in BC, it is now common to experience forest fire smoke in high concentrations. This is an excellent opportunity and time to study the effects of aerial perspective. Rather than requiring long distances for the effect to become observable, you can see the effect looking down your street. Houses at the further end will become more silhouette-like with lighter lights or darker lights and lighter darks. Let's unpack aerial perspective in a series of images. Here's a photo of Castle Crag Mountain. You can see some aerial perspective in behind it in the background. But Castle Crag itself is a mere kilometre or so distance, and there's little or no effect of aerial perspective. Let's crunch Castle Crag up a bit so that we can fit some other versions of it into the picture. And let's add a little bit of aerial perspective, not from distance, but due to the effect of looking through thicker atmosphere to the lower elevations. Why might this be? Think of being on a viewpoint above a valley and noticing how there is a gradation in the contrast of the valley's other side, from a darker top to a lighter bottom. This is because the lower atmosphere and the dust and particulates that it contains is denser lower down. You are looking through more atmosphere and particulate as you look down than when you look up. Think about a clear blue sky and recall how it gets darker as you look up. The sky from the horizon to above your head is a wonderfully orchestrated gradation from lighter values to darker values. When you look straight toward the horizon, you are looking through 30-odd kilometers of dense atmosphere near ground level. When you look straight up, you are looking through far less dense atmosphere to the vacuum of space, which is showing through and making the sky darker. You're actually looking through less atmosphere when you look straight up than you are looking at the horizon. This is what I'm trying to suggest in this photo of Castle Crag here. We are looking through denser atmosphere at lower elevations, and therefore there is a subtle atmospheric gradation, the high, as you look up. This is something to think about in the loose watercolor paintings we will be doing. The effect is not just in mountains. Think of visiting the coast with powerful swells pounding the shore. The breaking waves kick up water and salt particles which hang over beaches at lower elevations. Salt particles hang over beaches at lower elevations, creating a fog-like effect. You can see its effects in islands offshore and headlands. In these photos I pilfered off the internet. You can paint the coast. If you paint the coast, this is certainly an effect worth considering. Here are other examples of the phenomenon in art from Japan and China, showing how artists noticed this effect and employed the effect of gradating a landform from darker above to lighter below. Back to our unpacking of aerial perspective and our Castle Crag Mountain. So let's set the mountain, another mountain just like this one, a kilometer or two away. But let's eliminate any linear perspective. Let's make it exactly the same size, but pull down veils of atmosphere between the second and the first mountain and us. You can readily see it already looks further away despite not reducing in size. Contrast has been reduced. Darks are lighter and lights are darker, so there is a loss of contrast and complexity in the terrain. Its appearance is also bluer, indicating an atmosphere with many particles of water vapor. If we were in an atmosphere permeated with less water vapor and more smoke, perhaps, you'll see the haze is yellow, or if the sun is low, orange. When there is even subtle smoke and dust from fires or volcanoes in the atmosphere, sunsets are rosy red and dramatic. The livid reds in Edvard Munch's The Scream have been associated with dramatic sunsets of the time that were caused by volcanic ash, dust and aerosols from the eruption of Krakatoa. And Joseph William Millard Turner's livid red skies are allegedly influenced by the eruption of the Tambora volcano earlier in Indonesia. Photos from Mars often show a reddish tinge as a result of airborne dust from the red Martian soil. Of course, I have to add a couple of obligatory photos of similar atmospheric effects to Turner and Mars from the movie, from the neo-noir movie Blade Runner. Back to Castle Crag Mountain. Again, let's set it back with further veils of atmosphere pulled down over it. If you had a swatch of values in a scale for this iteration, the number has now been radically reduced to just a few midtones. And again, set back with more air between it and the other peaks and us. It is now reduced almost to a silhouette consisting of just a couple of barely perceptible values. And again, one last time, the haze has reduced the mountain to mere silhouette, and one that is very close in value to the ambient value of the sky. And that's how it works. Darken lights and lighten darks as you recede into the distance. Here's a quick sketch by an early watercolorist, Alexander Cozens, of an imaginary landscape generated by almost random ink blocks, but notice how he has carefully orchestrated aerial perspective to create pictorial depth. Here's a few examples of aerial perspective from my own work, done long ago now on a painting trip to Wales. Here's a photo I used for reference more recently, and here's the painting. You can see how I also divided up light and shade in the painting to create a more theatrical sense of space, but I've also increased the sense of aerial perspective. The fact is, if you paint on location on a day with a clear, clean atmosphere, particularly near midday or summer, your view is likely to be quite boring and flat. You will probably want to exaggerate lighting and aerial perspective to create a greater sense of drama. Here's a few more of my own paintings. And here's a reference photo for one, and here's the painting. I believe I've increased the aerial perspective and also created a swath of light in the middle ground. But you can't always see what you want at the time you are painting something, plein air or from reference. But when you are out and about, you must take mental notes of atmospheric phenomena, or real notes, or photos, or thumbnails to remind you of what you saw when you might later desire to apply it. Here's my friend Tack on a spire called Rambler Jr. Notice the aerial perspective. But here's the spire from the glacier behind him. Quite a boring shot. However, if a little cloud or mist moves in and creates aerial perspective and atmosphere, notice how much more interesting the view becomes. Even if I were using the other photo for design reference, the less interesting one, I might use this photo for atmospheric and painterly reference, combining the two. Want to see something weird? Nope, not this. This painting by Maynard Dixon, Southwest U.S. artist from sometime in the 30s or so. He was quite well known. You can see some aerial perspective, right? Well, desaturate and much of that mid-ground shadow disappears. Dixon is messing with us like the Impressionists did, or more correctly, messing with the rods and cones in our eyeballs. What he appears to have done is mix a cool purple shadow color that appears dark, but in actual fact is the same value as the warm yellow lit areas surrounding it. The purple shadow is cooler, but with a lot of white tint, and the yellow areas are warmer with more pigment or chroma, which translates into value when we desaturate the image. Our cone cells on our retina see the difference, and warm colors advance and cool colors recede, but our rod cells that only see black and white don't. So we kind of subtly short surface, and the painting perhaps creates a kind of perceptual tension for us. The Impressionists really messed around with this. Look at how bright the sun is and how it stands out here, but not when we desaturate it. Even more striking, look at the bright red poppies against the grass in this Monet. But when we desaturate it, they all but disappear. The poppies are the same value as the green grasses. This Impressionist trickery is not something we want to do in our painting, not yet. To create a strong sense of aerial perspective and pictorial depth, we want to keep it simple and have our hills retreat in an orderly, atmospheric fashion, as in the Castle Crag example or the Cozens sketch. Here are some beautifully articulated aerial perspective paintings, as well as beautifully articulated lighting in a couple of classic Bierstadt paint landscapes. Vast distances are not necessary to use the effect. You can force aerial perspective by creating a sense of mistiness. You could actually use it as a device in still life, even very subtly, or in a forest of trees, as I did here. I did something similar with this animation background. Notice that I've thrown the whole foreground into shadow. This is a very theatrical effect because I want the eye to go to the middle ground. I've been suggesting that contrast increases as things get closer, and indeed it does. But if I were to have jangling, noisy, high contrast in the foreground trees, it would distract from where I want the eye to go, which is the middle ground where the characters are. Throwing the foreground into darkness, or darkest darks, does the same job without jangly distractions, and you will frequently see this effect in animation and film, and even in 19th century landscapes. Of course, aerial perspective is used bigly in film. Sorry about that. Film noir used it. Back in the day, when everyone smoked incessantly, it was naturally created indoors with secondhand smoke. Filming in a cluttered room with a clear atmosphere would create a visual nightmare of busy, noisy distractions, and to this day filmmakers add smoke or vapor on indoor sets to create aerial perspective and produce contrast behind characters. The theatre creates atmosphere as well, sometimes with dry ice, but often just through considered illumination and simple set design. Atmospheric effects and perspective is even used out of doors, as in these movie forest scenes, for example. Obviously, atmospheric effects prove useful in film around haunted houses. Lots of concept art uses atmospheric and aerial perspective. Here are some examples of aerial perspective by the wonderful watercolorist Tony Onley. There were a couple of silkscreen printmakers called Peter and Traudl Markgraf, who were active in BC during the 70s and produced many very lovely prints using a process of gradation called blends. You can see how the blends often change not just in value but also change in color from top to bottom, and they create they create this sense of thicker atmosphere at lower elevations that we looked at previously. And in the Markgraf prints, you can also see aerial perspective at work in the receding prominent landforms, creating pictorial space and depth. The effect is simple and elegant. Compare their prints to the unpacking of Castle Crag that we looked at. Apparently the late Tony Onley began silk screening quite possibly under the tutelage of the master printers Traudl and Peter Markgraf, and came up with his own elegant designs featuring blends and with a strong sense of aerial perspective. So let's just finish off this video by showing a time lapse of how one might build up the most basic of atmospheric landscapes in watercolor. A simple grey, blue-green wash is used with no variation of colour to speak of. This could also just as easily be done using pencil or crayon with shading in a drawing course. First of all, a wash is applied over the whole paper. What will become the sky is gradated slightly from dark above to light below. This gradation could be pushed further, of course, something you might want to experiment with later on. After the paper has dried, a second wash is applied over everything we want to be a little darker. I've left a light area which might be a lake reflecting the value and colour of the sky. It is worth noting that in watercolour, timing is important as to when to apply subsequent washes like this. If I want an even more atmospheric effect, I could have started this wash before the paper had fully dried. Parts of the horizon might have been softened by the wet of still moist areas of paper, or the bleeding and softening of still moist areas of paper. Another wash is applied, and now on the now emerging landscape, bringing parts of the landscape closer still. And a final wash finishes the simple painting. As our eyes crave resolution, notice how areas of pooled color next to lighter values in the foreground suggest either convolutions in the topography or misty clouds. Wet watercolor technique has a characteristic and suggestive less is more quality. You can see this at work in classical Oriental style ink paintings, and you can also see it in the approach of Tony Onley, who actually went to Japan to study Oriental approaches and techniques. In closing, something we have to consider with watercolor painting, and ultimately any painting or drawing, is inconsistency of style and technique throughout a given painting, and how this inconsistency can create jarring effects for the viewer. I've suggested in drawing classes how varied approaches, treatments and exercises have been combined to create emergent personal styles. This is true and could be the case in watercolor too, in its own way, but when you have inconsistent styles or treatments used together, they look better when used consistently. This is difficult to describe, but when a consistent approach is arrived at in a piece, however inconsistent constituent parts are, it's a sign of maturity and wisdom in the artist. Artists like Tony Onley achieve this, particularly with his watercolors. In this rudimentary sketch you're looking at, it's achieved by sheer simplicity. But consider how if painterly blobs or dry brush strokes were used in the foreground to suggest trees, their treatment would be radically different, inconsistent with the rest of the painting. I would suggest it wouldn't work unless there were similar brushstrokes and applications of paint elsewhere. This is not to suggest it can't be done, just that it is challenging and might require months or even years to develop a coherent and evolve a coherent approach. One last note about watercolor, if I haven't mentioned it already: photograph your work as you proceed. Watercolor is notorious for screwing up or becoming overworked very quickly. If you take photos of a painting in progress, you might have tangible evidence of earlier iterations that were working far more successfully than your finished product, and by reviewing those photos, you might therefore be able to learn when to stop.